And we're back. Okay, let's see if I can remember how to do this. I'm Al Horner, and this is Script Apart, a podcast about the first draft secrets of great movies, returning at last for our third season. If you've listened before, you'll know that this is normally the part where I describe how each episode, an acclaimed writer revisits their first draft of what became a beloved movie. This season, though, we're switching things up a tiny bit. In Season 3, by popular demand, I've always wanted to use that phrase, we're going to be covering TV for the first time, alongside our usual episodes devoted to incredible films. Helping us kick off the season in style, holy forking shirt, we're delighted to have with us a true titan of modern TV comedy. Yes, this week we're joined by none other than Michael Schur, creator of The Good Place. Michael's resume is kind of insane. You might know him as the co-creator of shows like Parks and Recreation, Brooklyn Nine-Nine and Rutherford Falls. He was also a key creative force on The American Office during its early seasons. The Good Place is undoubtedly his most personal work though. It's a hilarious, philosophical probing of what it means to be a good person that ran for 4 seasons between 2016 and 2020. The show starred Kristen Bell as Eleanor, a self-described Arizona trash bag with an insatiable crush on the restless Stone Cold Steve Austin. The show begins with Eleanor dying and awaking in an afterlife that may not be all that it seems. In the conversation you're about to hear, Mike tells me all about his early vision for the show, why his original pilot doomed the Beatles to the bad place, sorry if you're listening Paul and Ringo, and what recently compelled him to write How to Be Perfect, a New York Times best-selling book that builds on the themes of The Good Place. Mike and I talk about the book, the mechanics of sitcom storytelling, the art of the cold open, which is something he's known for, and much, much more. It goes without saying that this is a spoiler-filled conversation. We focus mostly on the pilot, but also touch on plot points from across all 4 seasons. So if you're yet to see the show in its entirety, maybe pause now, then come back when you've seen it. I do not want to be sent to the bad place for ruining it for you. A special thank you to our Patreon supporters, that includes Matt Taff and John Topper. If you like what we do and want to help us continue to grow, you can get ad-free episodes and bonus content by joining us on patreon.com/scriptapart. Alright, that's enough from me. Let's get into it, shall we? This is Mike Schur talking about the first draft secrets of The Good Place. You're listening to Script Apart, hosted by me, Al Horner, produced by Camille Demek. Mike, welcome to Script Apart. How are you doing today?
I'm doing very well. How are you doing?
I'm doing all the better for having you on the show, man. I gotta say right away that I just finished How to Be Perfect, which, I absolutely adored, insofar as you can adore something that sends you into a bit of a headspin about the near impossibility of being a good person at, any time, but especially in our kind of current modern world. I guess I'll start by asking whether writing something long form like this, was tricky compared to tackling half-hour episodes of TV. Was it an endurance test, or did it all kind of spill out of you because clearly you've had this topic on your mind for a long time?
Yeah, I think it's a combo platter of those two things. A little bit of it, some of it was just it spilled out of me because I've been writing about it and thinking about it and reading about it for a long time. Other parts of it were more of an endurance test because it was new to me. I had never written a book before. And also, when you're used to writing things in a room full of 12 really funny people, like what happens is you get to a point where you're like, well, this joke sucks. Someone write a better one. And you look around and then someone writes a better joke. And this time I would say, well, this joke sucks. Someone write a better one. And I would look around and I was alone in my house and very scared. And a couple of times, actually, I emailed the writing staff of The Good Place and said, hey, I'm writing this book and I wrote this joke and it sucks. Can one of you write a better one? And then they would send like 10 better jokes in 2 seconds. And then that just made me feel like low self-esteem and shame because I was like, how am I not better at this? So some of it was very difficult, but I enjoyed it. It was a pandemic. It ended up accidentally being my pandemic project because I sold the book in February of 2020. And then I was sort of like, well, how am I going to write this? I don't have enough time. And then suddenly I had nothing but time and couldn't go anywhere else and had no excuses.
Yeah, so with COVID, it must have felt like the book you were writing was also kind of playing itself out in the news every single day, right? I mean, the pandemic really did force us to confront questions of utilitarianism, how to be a good person, what it is that we owe to each other, all concepts that you were grappling with in How to Be Perfect.
It felt exactly like that. Yeah. I mean, I I've said this before, but it was very hard not to make the whole book about how do we behave during COVID, because what was remarkable about it and continues to be remarkable about it is that it, I believe, is the first time in human history that every single person on Earth was faced with the same questions, ethical and otherwise, at the same exact time. I mean, we literally had the same problem. That's never happened before. Like even World War II or something, you can go back and find countries that were so remote or distant or uninterested in the affairs of the warring nations that they just kind of hung out and waited for it to blow over. But there's no hiding from COVID. There's no hiding from a disease that's contagious. So I had to restrain myself from making every chapter be an explication of the ways in which various philosophical ideas related to this particular issue, because that would have been really boring. It was in a weird way a mirror of the show, of The Good Place, which is the show the book came out of, because that show was developed in 2015. And I did not think that we were in this country about to elect a president whose behavior would cause the word ethics to appear in the national discourse essentially every day, like that, which is what happened. You know, like most US presidents have ethical problems and lapses, and they do things either in office or before they get to office that raise all these ethical questions. That's par for the course. But the last president that we had, the one we elected in 2016, whose name I don't particularly enjoy saying out loud, he was a guy whose every behavior for his entire life had led to people saying like, well, is this unethical? The answer was always yes. And so while the show was on the air, I just wanted to discuss ethics and as like human behavior on a very small level. You know, the average person living his or her life, going about his or her business, doing whatever we do when we mill around. That's what I was interested in. And then almost exactly when the show sort of came on the air, the word ethics was just being blasted on the front page of every newspaper every single day. And it was a complete coincidence. And the book and COVID felt a little bit like round two of that, where I, again, just wanted to sort of discuss this stuff because I find it interesting. And then we all went through something simultaneously that led to people talking about asking these questions all the time. It was very odd. I think on balance, it's bad, right? I think both of those things, the world would have been better off if neither of those things had happened. And both the show and the book were just like slight little asterisks in the history of the American discourse. But as it turned out, they both mirrored something enormous that was going on in the country and the world at the time that they sort of were released into the public.
As you underline in your book, like these are questions about how to live a just moral life that have been plaguing mankind for as long as mankind's been around. Mm-hmm. Like the themes of the book and The Good Place, they're pretty timeless. But yeah, there was something timely about the series that really gave it a sense of urgency that it's kind of interesting to contemplate watching it without, but that's how it rolled. So Mike, the story I've heard, you were stuck in LA traffic one day, and you know this is kind of the origin story of The Good Place, and you sort of starting to kind of confront a lot of questions that filled The Good Place. So you'll have to correct me if I'm wrong, you were watching drivers who were cutting each other off or were using the emergency lane because they obviously thought that their time matters more than anyone else's. Mm-hmm. And yeah, you'd kind of remark that, okay, that guy just lost 16 points, that kind of thing. This sort of implication being that we're all kind of winning and losing points in this giant existential morality video game that we're all that we're all a part of. Mm-hmm. So I'm curious to know, like, before that point though, were you philosophically minded? Were like, as a kid, there's kind of small traces, I'd say, of like these questions in your previous work, but nothing pronounced. So yeah, was that traffic jam moment an epiphany, or were you always contemplating goodness and what it means to live ethically?
I was always a rule follower. I never cut class in high school or college, really. I was a good kid. I didn't like break curfew. I liked the feeling of knowing what the rules were and then following the rules. And to the point, and I talk about some of this in the book, but I remember being at parties in college and there was a noise curfew. And if like you weren't allowed to play loud noise after, I think it was 1 a.m. or midnight on a weekday and 1 a.m. on a weekend or something. And if I was in someone else's room and it got past that time, I would start to get nervous, and I would sort of maybe even on occasion edge over to the stereo and just nudge the music down a little bit, because I was like, well, the rule is we can't play loud music after. And like, I wasn't going to get in trouble. Like the people whose room I was in would be getting in trouble. And as I say in the book, you can imagine how popular this made me in college. Not very. So the inclination to kind of know what rules are and follow them and understand right from wrong has always been there. And I don't know why. I don't think it's anything. I think this is one of those chicken and egg things where it's like, is it genetic? Is it learned? I don't know. But that inclination has always been there. And then as I've grown up and I went to college, I took a couple philosophy classes in college, wasn't like obsessed with it or anything. But the combo platter of learning a little bit of philosophy and then also having this kind of my antenna already being up for these questions eventually kind of coalesced into something. Like it became more of an obsession of mine after I think I got really interested in politics, because I find that political ethics are their own animal, but I find political lapses in unethical behavior amongst politicians to be the most annoying, because I'm hardly the first person to say this, but we're literally electing these people to represent us, and they promise certain things every 2 years or 4 years, and they appear, you give them something very valuable. You give them your faith and your trust and your money on occasion. And when they do things that are so obviously unethical, it feels like a deeper wound to the psyche to me. If your friend, does something slightly unethical, you're like, well, whatever. That's Joe. He's kind of he's kind of an idiot and whatever. I expect that from him. But I didn't take time out of my day and go to a polling station and like pull a lever with Joe's name on it and make him my friend. Like, like there's other things I know about him that maybe could help me put his behavior into some kind of perspective. But when it's a politician you've elected, it really, really rankles me, like the hypocrisy and the cheating and the inside information and the personal gain and all that sort of stuff. So that it really began to kind of take off for me in my 30s and now 40s. And then, yes, I had invented this imaginary video game that I thought we were all playing, or I hoped we were all playing. I would see someone, like you said, cut me off in traffic, and I would assign them negative 12 points. And really, that was just a coping mechanism to get through the day, because on the average day, we all see so many annoying behaviors exhibited by our fellow humans that if you don't come up with some kind of way to imagine that they are going to suffer for those actions, you'll lose your mind, like literally what I was doing is no different from what organized religion has done for thousands of years, which is imagine that your behaviors on earth will be punished at some later date. I just made it more of a kind of like a video game, I guess. And then all of that stuff kind of came together, and that's what led me to creating The Good Place and eventually writing the book.
Let's talk about the development a little bit, because I've got to ask, Mike, like when the show was first announced in, I think it was 2016, well, either the show went through some serious evolution in terms of the premise, or you were holding back a lot of vital elements. Because, well, I'll just read a little bit from the press release here. It says, it describes a show involving Eleanor, a woman from New Jersey who comes to realize that she hadn't been a very good person. Mm-hmm. She decides to turn over a new leaf by learning what it means to be good or bad. Ted Danson plays Michael, who comes to be Eleanor's guide through her self-designed self-improvement course. So was that a case of misdirection, wanting to keep the afterlife premise under wraps and to kind of focus viewers on the theme of the show rather than the table setting? Or was there really a version early on where Michael rather than Chidi was Eleanor's guide?
No, it is 100% misdirection. So I don't know what it's like in the UK, but when you sell a TV show or a movie in the States, what happens is there's an entire industry, there's a machine that traffics in the inside information about the project. And they want to know a few basic things all the time: character names, actors playing those characters, descriptions of those characters, and then plot descriptions. And in this case, I had a show that was set in the afterlife. Ted Danson was going to play an eternal, immortal being who, and this is a spoiler, if you haven't seen the show, stop listening now. He was going to appear to be one thing and then be revealed at the end of the first season to be something incredibly different. And I was extremely convinced that there was absolutely no benefit 6-8 months out or whatever it was to have anyone know anything about those characters or the show or where it took place or what the point of it was. And so, again, I'll remind you before I tell you the story that I am an extreme rule follower. I don't like lying. I don't like cheating. I don't like anything in that realm. But what I realized was that I went back and looked at some of the announcements of other TV shows and movies and stuff. And I realized that like no one ever went back and looked to see how these shows were described when they were first announced, because it's a 4-hour story that it gets announced. People remark on it for 4 hours or 6 hours. And then the next day, 8 other things are announced and everybody moves on. And so I started to realize that the way through this was lying. I was just going to lie. I was like, I don't think that there's any reason not to, because I don't think anybody has the right to know what the premise of the show is 6 months before the show comes out. So I was extraordinarily vague, much to the chagrin of the people who pay me, and my agents and managers and people like that. I just was like, I'm going to either be extremely vague or I'm going to lie. So if you look up, Darcy Carden played a character named Janet. And Janet is the manifestation, a physical manifestation of all of the information that has ever existed in the universe. And it's sort of like Siri or Alexa, but in a humanoid form. And I had this whole plan for her character and what was going to happen to her. But I didn't, of course, want to say anything about who she was going to be. So if you look at the announcement of Darcy Carden being cast as Janet, it says something like she plays Janet Della D'Annunzio, a violin salesman with a shady past, or something like that. I mean, it's just a straight up lie. And it got reported exactly that way. And then the show came out and she obviously was not a violin salesman with a shady past. She was something very different. And to this day, no one has ever come to me and said, hey, how dare you? How dare you mislead us as to what character Darcy Carden was playing? And I think that what I learned was a good and bad lesson. The good lesson was you can get away with that and it will help your show because people won't jump to conclusions about what it's going to be, that you won't spoil anything. You can actually get to the point where the show is airing and not have people know what it is. The bad lesson I learned is that lying works sometimes, that it's good to lie and that you can get what you want out of lying. And so I did wrestle with the decision to do that. But ultimately, I feel like it serves no one to have anyone know what you're working on long before it actually appears and is able to be watched by people.
Can we make a show where Darcy plays a violin salesman with a checkered past?
The joke that we tried to work in for 4 years, we tried as a little reference to get her. There's a season, again, spoiler, apologies, but there's a season where they go to Earth and they're pretending to be humans. And I was like, is there any way that I can claim that her job there is that she's a violin salesman? I think I was just looking for a way to let myself off the hook for lying to people. But she would be. I mean, she'd be great as any role. But I would love to use that as a starting point. Darcy plays a violin salesman with a shady past.
So if there wasn't a retooling of Janet working her backwards from a violin salesman, what were some of the kind of initial ideas you explored that maybe you abandoned, like en route to kind of this amazing premise and these characters? Were there any kind of big changes that you kind of played around with before landing on The Good Place as we know it? So for the purposes of this podcast, I think it might actually be more interesting to talk about the entire first season instead of the pilot, because the pilot, the
So to back up for a second, when I finally had the idea, and I'll describe what the idea was in a second, I realized that it was too risky, both for me as a writer and for the studio and network who were going to make it, to move forward until I had a lot more than the idea for the pilot. So the initial idea I had for the pilot was simply that there is this afterlife that's extremely restrictive, that only the very, very, very top point getters get in, and that Kristen Bell would play a character who, through some sort of clerical error, had been given an eternity in this paradise when she was very obviously, based on her life, ticketed for, the other place, the less good place. And as an act one of a pilot, I thought, that's really good. That's juicy. The act one break is, I'm not supposed to be here. I get exactly how that works. I can see the whole thing, the beautiful Edenic paradise and all of the wonderful people who have deserved to get there. And then there she is, this kind of trashy garbage person who definitely didn't. And then I sort of thought, like, okay, well, what kind of show does that lead to? That leads to a show where there's a person that she meets who knows exactly what a good person is, because that person has spent his life teaching ethics, teaching moral philosophy. And she basically says to him, if you can teach me how to be a good person, if I can hide long enough in plain sight and you can teach me how to be a good person, then I will have earned my spot here and I won't have to hide anymore. Okay, good. What kind of show does that lead to long term? Like what's episode 3? What's episode 7? That kind of thing. That's where I started to get nervous. And so at a point where I would ordinarily have gone to my bosses and pitched them the show, I thought, like, I can't do this yet. If I'm pitching Brooklyn Nine-Nine with Dan Gore, my friend who created it with me, or Parks and Recreation with Greg Daniels, we could go to them and say, here are 7 characters. Here are the actors we want to play them. Here's the setting. Here's the world. Like you can kind of project forward into how that show is going to unfold over potentially many years. This was very different. This was like heavily serialized and it had all these twists and turns. It felt like Lost or something where you need to know. And in fact, I talked to Damon Lindelof about the show and said, like, what pitfalls am I going to fall into here? And the number one thing he said was, you have to know where you're going. And if you don't know what the end point is, you'll tread water and people will get annoyed, because that's what happened to them on Lost. So I kept going. I kept working on the show on my own. And I got to the point where I came up with the idea that the whole thing was actually, spoiler alert, again, sorry, the whole thing was actually an experimental torture chamber. And I got to that point by reading about a lot of conceptions of the afterlife in different religions and realizing that they all shared something, or philosophical writing about religious conceptions of the afterlife all came to the same conclusion, which is any kind of eternity is torture. Like there's no such thing as an eternity that is even in paradise. And certain religions, like Hinduism, for example, understand that. And, you get to the end of that line and then you go back to you reset, you go back to the beginning, because you can't just be a god forever. It's very boring. So I came up with the twist that ends the first season. And then I thought, okay, now I can imagine how this show would continue with the future. So the pilot really was only like step 1 in a very long sequence of steps that then over time did change and evolve and kind of I made significant revisions to. But the pilot itself stayed pretty much the same the whole time that it was in development. So that was a very long-winded way of saying that if we want to talk about first drafts, then we need to kind of discuss the entire season instead of the very first episode.
Yeah, sure. But, as you bring it up, like that act 1 break, I remember just like the oh shit moment of watching that for the first time. But it's funny kind of looking back, that setup, there is so much comic potential in it that I kind of expected that to be drawn out for the whole season, if not the entire show.
Right.
But instead, you kind of race through reveals. And as you say, in a very kind of lost manner, you kind of end pretty much every single episode on some sort of twist or some sort of revelation. Was that kind of driven by putting 2 and 2 together, perhaps getting 5? Like in my mind, this is a show essentially about death in some ways. It's That's not a prime time comedy subject matter traditionally. Was it like, I need to keep this thing moving and I need to keep like the pace up and the story constantly in motion, because it is such a risky prospect and it needs to have momentum behind it? What was the kind of thinking behind serializing in this way and having that number of twists and revelations?
So my mentor in this business was Greg Daniels, who adapted The British Office and created Parks and Rec with me. And he had this theory about TV shows, which I think is really smart. He has a lot of theories about TV shows, and they're all smart because he's smart. One of them is that the setting for a show should be as bland and boring as possible, because what you want is for the characters to be the things that step forward toward the audience and shine and become the things that they attach to. And if you think about what you might consider the greatest TV comedies of all time, things like Cheers and The Office and, All in the Family, any of those shows, Friends. I mean, what's the premise of Friends? A group of attractive people live near each other. That's the premise of the show Friends, maybe the most beloved sitcom of the last 30 years. Yeah. So when I came up with this idea, I heard his words ringing in my ear. And what I was worried about, so the second half of that theory is, if you make a pilot with an enormous premise, with this huge, glossy, shiny, shimmering premise, then what happens is that premise burns off after a while, and because the audience isn't attached to the characters, they kind of get bored. It's the same thing every time. It's this giant, shiny setting or locale or whatever. So in the very beginning, when I came to the same conclusion that you just came to, which is, this is a big comedy idea, right? A garbagey, trashy person is in heaven essentially and is trying not to get caught. That sounds great, but it sounds great as a movie, right? It doesn't sound great as an ongoing concern, because if you are in episode 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, all down the line, and it's the same thing, she's almost getting caught, she figures out a way to wriggle free, you just start to get bored, because who cares? Like, I've seen this before. It's like watching a movie 10 times in a row. So what I felt before I even had the big twist at the end of the first season, I had this real serious feeling that new stuff needed to be happening all the time. That's where Lost came in. That's why I went to Damon, because I felt like what was so thrilling about that show when it first burst onto the scene was 2 things. One is, they zeroed in on a different character in each episode, and you started to learn who that person was and what that person's life was like and what sequence of events had led them to be on the plane. But you also were like, now there's a polar bear on the island, and now there's a weird smoke monster, and now there's like some weird other people that you haven't seen before, and now like you just kept the number of pieces. He was putting a new piece on the chessboard every single episode. So I started to think like, well, if I'm going to pull off the same thing comedically, the first thing I thought was, another person needs to be a mistake. That was the first thing that I like, the first conclusion I came to was, there needs to be someone else who's like Eleanor, because what I was doing was creating all of these, trying to create these like vectors, these kind of connections between and among different characters. So I came up with this idea that there would be a character who appeared to be an East Asian monk who didn't speak. And then when he finally spoke, he would be even a dumber, more garbagey person than Eleanor was, who was like, I don't know what's going on. Everybody thinks I'm a monk. And I realized that I could play on some stereotypes about Asian people, East Asian people specifically, some stereotypes about the kind of person who might end up in heaven, and get this really big, juicy, kind of funny reveal at like 3 or 4 episodes in. So I just started making a list of like, what could happen? Like, what are things that could happen? She could get a note under her door that says, you don't belong here. She could be assigned to work with Michael to find the person that was causing the problems in the neighborhood. And we basically burned through all of them. We did every single one of them in order to try to send the message to people that they were not going to watch the same movie over and over and over again, that the movie was going to change and grow, and that things were going to happen that would be interesting and would change the basic foundation of what they were looking at.
It's interesting in this, like, in the draft that I've read of the pilot, you know, there are some jokes in there that didn't make the cut. Like, I think you mentioned the Beatles being in the bad place, which not a question, more of a comment, Mike. How dare you? Yeah, because Paul McCartney wrote "Wonderful Christmas Time."
Yep,
yeah.
That's right. That's also been a long. I've been grinding that axe for so long. I mean, look, nobody loves the Beatles more than me. Like, I mean, they're, you know, they're one of the great artistic loves of my life. But "Wonderful Christmas Time," you're going right to hell if you write that song. I'm sorry. That's it's an absolute deal breaker.
Well, I mean, there's lots of things like that. There's there's another joke in here about Sinatra being one of the JFK shooters. So there's lots of things like that for whatever reason came out. But, you know, how did you decide, you know, the best way to deploy that and how to not use it as a crutch? Like, I know you'd played around with a similar format in the final season of Parks. Like, how did you kind of work out how often to use this here?
It's a good question. I forgot about the joke that Sinatra killed JFK. That was a good one. There was another, at some other point, we may have also cut it. We made the joke that Shirley Temple had killed JFK. I think we cut that one too. That was like, okay, so the main, like in terms of tone, right? The main discussion that I had with the writers and with Drew Goddard, who directed the pilot and was an executive producer on it for all 4 seasons. We talked about tone so often because tone is the slipperiest and most maddening aspect of a show. And what we sort of arrived at 2 conclusions. One of them was that kind of joke, the kind of joke that's like, hey, do you want to know the truth about the JFK assassination? It turns out it was Frank Sinatra. Just had to be used very sparingly because those jokes are they're a dime a dozen, and they all kind of make me laugh. And they're also the kind of thing that the audience will get very bored of very quickly, right? And I think that the fantasy of dying and going to some kind of paradise and having Janet be there and being able to call Janet whenever you want and saying like, hey, when I was in 3rd grade, I lost my baseball cards and I never found them. Where were they? And then she says like, oh, they accidentally got thrown out. Your uncle accidentally threw them in the trash. Like there is a real fantasy dream aspect to how wonderful that would be to just solve all of life's little mysteries that you didn't know, whether they're who killed JFK or what happened to my baseball cards. So we just decided we'd had to be really surgical when it came to that kind of joke. The other thing we went through was in the pilot, basically the way that the pilot sort of culminates is that Eleanor shows up and is not supposed to be there and does a bunch of bad stuff and excuse me, and the whole place goes haywire, right? It's like the entire neighborhood there's like a virus in the software and all this chaos happens. This giant ladybug terrorizes the neighborhood and all of these things like explode and flowers come to life and start eating each other. And that's how Eleanor realizes the true stakes of her hiding there is that because the place was designed for good people and she's not a good person, her bad actions will lead to this kind of chaos happening. And obviously it's all in the service of Michael tormenting her and torturing her. But in that, so we wrote this chaos sequence and it was with Drew, who's directing it. It was the biggest kind of, most expensive kind of enormous thing that we were doing. And he and I sat down one day and we made a list of just funny things that we could see. And we had, at one point we had 2 men in like 18th century, like Dangerous Liaisons era uniforms having a sword fight and yelling at each other in French. And but their heads were like dragon heads or something. And we had a translucent octopus floating through and like talking to people and stuff. And it was all making us laugh. And it was really funny in our brains. And we actually shot some of it. Like we hired two professional sword fighters to come and dress up in dangerous liaisons unit costumes and have a sword fight. And Drew shot that on camera. And then we looked at the whole thing and we were like, well, this is ridiculous. Like, this is just gibberish, right? It's nonsense. It doesn't have any relevance. It's just crazy flights of fancy that don't feel funny, really, because they don't have any connection to anything real. And we came to this conclusion way too late. All of the chaos had to be about the bad things that Eleanor had done. It's such an obvious conclusion. And if I were more on top of my game, I would have realized this months earlier and saved everybody a lot of time and money. But it was like the nickname that she calls Tahani, the character Tahani,
a butthead, right?
Well, so in the original version, she called her a butthead, and then she saw Tahani walking around and her head was on her butt. And we shot that too. We shot like a thing where Tahani's head was on where her butt should be, and she had no head, and she was going, "What's going on? What's going on? What's going on?" And it didn't look good. It's a harder effect to actually enact than it is to dream up. But I was like, okay, go back, and she also calls her a giraffe. And what will be much better is if we just have a bunch of giraffes running around and terrorizing the neighborhood, because that is just a more obvious thing. Like she's used to, it's like that ridiculous giraffe, and then there's giraffes running around, and the things that roll down the street aren't bowling balls or something. They're the pill bottles that Eleanor sold when she was on Earth. So it was a good lesson to learn, both about like the tone in terms of how wild and crazy things should get, but also these things don't matter. They don't have any actual relevance or connection or emotional resonance unless they're things that Eleanor has done specifically over the course of the pilot. And that was a really good lesson to learn that early, because when you're in a world where there are essentially no rules, right? It's the afterlife. Anything is possible. Michael or Janet can snap their fingers and anything can just pop in. It was a good lesson about keeping that under a lid so that it didn't spiral out of control. And also, the only things that will matter are things that are either just on their own or funny, or more importantly, if they have some kind of actual connection to the characters and the story you're telling. And so that was a harsh lesson to learn. We wasted tens of thousands of dollars of NBC's money before we learned that lesson.
So any aspiring filmmakers listening, if you're gonna make a character literally have a butt head, go practical. It's an expensive and difficult shot.
It's very, very difficult to do. Yes, lessons I would not recommend. Yeah, if you take nothing else from this podcast.
So in terms of tone, I guess that's why there's a joke in the draft where I see why it would have come out, and I can imagine it came out for tone reasons. There's a joke in this cold open in which Eleanor can't stop farting and has to drink some kind of like magical blue liquid to deal with a condition called post-revelation gas explosion. And I kind of love the alternate reality in which this show, dealing in Cartesian principles and deontology and all these big heady philosophical arguments seldom seen on primetime TV before. I love the idea of it opening with a barrage of fart jokes, but I can see why it didn't happen. But while we're on the topic of cold opens, Mike, like obviously like Parks and Rec, Brooklyn Nine-Nine, The Office, these shows all were kind of renowned for their cold opens. Mm-hmm. And the cold open here is just so fun. You know, it culminates with Eleanor going, "Did I have my purse with me? Oh, nope, I'm dead. Right, let's go." Yeah. What's the secret to a great cold open, would you say?
Well, so two things. One, that thing about her uncontrollably farting was pure fear on my part, right? I was like, the cold open of this pilot and of the whole show is this woman is dead and she's in some kind of crazy eternal paradise. And there's a discussion about like which religion was right in terms of how they conceived of the afterlife. Like there's a lot of it's a lot of big swings being taken very quickly. And I remember writing that and thinking like, I want to send the message to people who might be saying like, oh, I like Kristen Bell. I like Ted Danson. What's this show about? Like, I didn't want them to think, oh, I'm in some kind of religion class in college and I'm going to have to do homework. Like I was like, I maybe I need to do like the dumbest joke I can think of, that in order to just send the message, like, don't worry, if you're just looking for comedy, you're also in the right place, you know? And also and it also happened to fit in with the big long game that I was playing, where when you look back, I needed everybody to look back on everything at the end of the first season when the big twist happens and think like, is it consistent? Were they actually being tortured the whole time? And that was the perfect kind of thing that would be like, yeah, he was just messing around with her, right? He was just making her fart for no reason, just to embarrass her and to make her to like sort of torture her. But I cut it because I was like, I need to trust that the premise is interesting enough to, you know, to sustain at least 2 minutes. If I can't get through 2 minutes of people before they tune out, then I'm in trouble. But in terms of the cold open, so on those other shows, like the perfect comedy cold open in my mind is like a sketch. It's I started at Saturday Night Live. A lot of the other writers have worked in late night, and a perfectly executed like 90-second sketch. That's one idea, just one comedic idea, executed quickly and swiftly and efficiently, that has a big final joke that's like a blow before you go careening into the main, you know, opening credits of the show. That's a perfect cold open. As time has gone on, we're really crunched for time on network shows over here. It's 21 minutes and 30 seconds per episode. And what often ends up happening is you have to put an element of the story into the cold open because you just don't have time to have a standalone sketch and then start your story in act one. So we would often shoot a cold open and then cut it and move what would be normally the first scene of the show into the cold open. After a while on Parks and Recreation, we just started writing the cold opens as the first scene of usually the A story. But there are many that we wrote on that show too, that Brooklyn was more committed to it. Brooklyn really had, and that's Dan Gore's show. You know, he and I created it together. I left after a couple of years, but they were really committed to like, we are going to do a 60-second or 80-second comedy sketch at the beginning of every episode. And I think people really love them. I think they're very memorable. The one that they did where Jake Peralta is is in a criminal lineup, and the criminal Boys. They start singing "I Want It That Way" by the Backstreet Boys. Like, that is just an all-time classic cold open. Like, you'll never, in terms of pure comedic idea and execution, like, you'll never beat that, I think. So when they work, they're just wonderful because it's like you know what it is? It's like an amuse-bouche in a restaurant. Like, you go to a nice restaurant and you're excited about your meal, and you order all this food and you're so excited for the food. And then the waiter comes and says, here's a little extra thing we're just giving you. It's a tiny little delicate piece of pastry that has like a cool, interesting flavor to it. And you didn't order it. You didn't expect it. But there it is. And you eat it and it's delicious and you're so happy. And then you get the whole meal that you ordered. You know, that's what a great cold open is. And when it works really well, it's like this bonus. It's just like a bonus chunk of comedy that you get before you are even in the middle of the story that you're about to watch.
So in this pilot script, Eleanor describes her parents as being dead and having been wonderful people, which, of course, well, as the show goes on, we not only discovered that they're not dead, but we really learned that Eleanor's mum was, in fact, not wonderful, not in the slightest. That becomes a really key insight into the character of Eleanor, like her whole no bullshit attitude and the extent to which she lives life, like, you know, with her guardrails up. That's very much a product of her relationship with her mum. So yeah, Mike, I'm curious, like, how much of, the relationships you were going to explore and the mythology of the good place you were going to explore, how much of that did you have mapped out as you tackled this pilot? Like, did you know you were going to explore Eleanor's parents? Did you know that the end game was going to be Eleanor and co kind of exposing the flaws in the entire afterlife system? How much of the destination did you already have in mind at this early point?
Some of it was just a vague idea. The idea that the system by which they're being judged is itself deeply flawed. I knew that. I didn't know that it was going to become the sort of focus of the show. But I knew because I had been reading all this moral philosophy, and over and over again, having the experience of thinking like, okay, this philosophy makes a lot of sense. And then I would read critiques of that philosophy and go like, oh yeah, those critiques also make sense. And starting to come to the conclusion that there was no way that you can mathematically approach the concept of morality. It's just impossible. It's too gray and too mushy. And there was no theory. If there were one theory on morality that were mathematically provable, that's the one we would have adopted by now, right? Like all the other ones would have gone away. Yeah. So some of that was lingering and was very much in the first season. Like we'll get to that later. Like put that aside. We'll come back to that. The thing about her parents was the only character I would say that I really went into great detail on in terms of backstory was Eleanor before writing the pilot, because I thought like, okay, what kind of person is this? This is a person who her essential attitude, which she expresses many times, is I don't owe you anything and you don't owe me anything. That was the way she lived her life. That was the credo, the essence of who she was. And so we needed to create a version of a woman like that who would still potentially be sympathetic to an audience, right? You don't want the audience to hate the main character, even if you're starting her out in this terrible place. So the kind of person that she was led me to the idea that her parents were just disasters, that they were bad people, that they had been narcissistic, that she had had to develop, like you say, all of these coping mechanisms and these self-defense mechanisms. And that she realized at a very young age that her parents, the people charged with protecting her and keeping her safe and happy and warm, had failed. And that her entire life had been one of putting on suits of armor and fending off anyone who tried to get close to her. So we made her parents both dead in part because I wanted the story to be, they did a terrible job and then they disappeared and she was just abandoned. She was on her own. There was no one around looking after her. And all of the lessons that she should have learned about how to like coexist with people and how to rely on people and what it's like to have other people rely on you and all that sort of stuff, that went out the window at a very early age. And so I had this backstory for her, which we then explored later in the season, which was her parents were nightmares. When she was like 14, she emancipated herself. She lied on an application and got a job. She moved into an apartment by herself and was just her whole life was like, this is the only way through this, is to just don't trust anyone but yourself. Don't rely on anyone. Keep everybody at arm's length. Make no apologies for it. No one's looking out for you, all that sort of stuff. So we made both her parents dead. And then I realized in the third season that I really wanted one of her parents to still be alive and was like, uh-oh. And so then we came up with the story that her mom had faked her own death and abandoned her, which luckily fit exactly into the design of the kind of parent that we were suggesting that she had had all along. So that wasn't a case of like, that was a case of like, I think it was the right decision in the moment to say that in the pilot. And then later we just found a little loophole of how we could get her back into the fold and have Eleanor actually interact with her, which she then did to great effect.
You can kind of see how you built the other characters in the ensemble out from Eleanor. You can see how Tahani is Eleanor's opposite. And you can see also, you mentioned about how it would be great fun to have someone else who's in a similar situation. That's how you come up with Jason. And then, of course, you have to have Chidi, who would be, the kind of spiritual guide, philosophical guide for Eleanor. But it's interesting, kind of, we should touch briefly on the ensemble. And I'm curious especially to know about Jason. We touched on him earlier, and you've described him previously as, you wanted to create a character who made Chris Pratt's character in Parks look like a member of Mensa.
That's right.
And I love Jason so much. And obviously he isn't the smartest, he's not the smartest, but there's something consistent with the rest of your work, across all these shows, where even though he isn't smart, even though a lot of jokes are about how he doesn't understand a situation or can't comprehend something, it never feels mean-spirited. And I was curious if you had like a philosophy about kind of striking a balance in those terms, never punching down, always keeping a sense of kindness to your work, even when you're sort of dealing in those kind of jokes. Yeah,
that is my preferred method of humor. I don't like insult humor that much. I don't like people being mean to each other for no reason. However, it is also true that there has never been a great comedy show without a dumb guy. There has to be a dumb guy. It's just Greg Daniels also used to say, dumb is the nuclear weapon of comedy. Like it just obliterates everything else. It's always the funniest joke is the dumb guy. And so I try, when I create dumb guy characters, to make them slightly more interesting than just only being dumb, right? Like Jason Mendoza by far is the most emotionally intelligent character on the show. There are moments in the show where he is the only person who understands the feelings that other people are having. And he's also the most warm-hearted by far. He's the most genuine and sincere by far. And he's also utterly unabashed in the way that he moves through life. Like he doesn't feel any sadness about how dumb he is. He doesn't particularly care. But there's a moment in he and Tahani have a fairly substantial, although in the world of the show also fairly brief, actual romantic entanglement. And it happens because Tahani's miserable and he's the only one who really sees it. And what the advice that he gives her is that she is thinking about she's hung up on the wrong things. And Andrew Law, one of the writers on the show, wrote this scene, and it's so good. And what he says to her is, you should be nicer to yourself, which is advice that everyone should probably take all the time. Like, not everyone. Some people are super into themselves, and those people can also be annoying. But when we are really hard on ourselves, it's often for things that we shouldn't be hard on ourselves for. And I remember just loving the way that Andrew phrased that, because not just because it was good advice, but because it really spoke to like what was good and interesting about Jason beyond the fact that he wasn't very bright. And I really love when people who are deficient in one character trait are then have another one in ample supply. And I always loved the moments where Jason proved himself to be a person worthy of time and attention and friendship for the other people in the show. So yeah, Manny Jacinto is just a singular kind of performer. I don't know that I've ever seen anyone else quite like him. And that character was originally conceived of as much more of like a bro, like a kind of fratty, just kind of asshole, honestly. And Manny gave we wrote this audition scene. All the audition scenes were fake because I didn't want any details leaking out. And we wrote this audition scene where he had invented a combination mouthwash and body spray. And he was angry at his roommates because his roommates who were going in on it with him didn't believe in it as much as he did. And the scene was very much like three meathead frat guys kind of like jawing at each other. And when Manny read the audition, he got legitimately emotionally upset. He was like crying at the lack of faith that his roommates had in this ridiculous body spray / mouthwash. And it was so funny. And he was the only one who did it like that. He was the only actor who like made this kind of wonderfully vulnerable choice. And we watched it in the writer's room like 50 times. And because I was like, this is the guy we got to write to. Like, I had an idea in my head of what this guy was going to be. And this actor did it better than I had it in my head. And we should junk what I had in my head in favor of this actor, because that version of this is so much more interesting and so much funnier and more lovable than the guy I had conceived of. And so we really we threw out we kept that he was really dumb and he was from Jacksonville. And we replaced that he was an asshole with that he was like a sweet and vulnerable person. And I think that is the difference between a stock character who is just two-dimensional and kind of okay and fine and can get laughs, and a character that you eventually fall in love with and really care about deeply.
And we've talked a lot, Mike, about like this pilot episode and the beginning of The Good Place. But to skip forward to the ending, I don't want to make any assumptions about your relationship with the show, but it's your show. It wasn't co-created with anyone. The themes of the show are so close to your heart. You've literally just written a book with them. There was obviously something that you couldn't shake about it. Mm-hmm. I can imagine it being a really emotional story to bring to a close. How tricky was that final episode for you?
Very. The show was largely about Western concepts of moral philosophy. It was Aristotle and Kant and the utilitarians and people like that. And all the way right up through the second to last episode, we were still talking about that stuff. Lisa Kudrow was playing Hypatia of Alexandria, a Western philosopher from the BCE era. And we were still talking about conceptions of eternity and morality and everything else. But for more than a year, we had been also talking about the very end. And I felt like at the very end, all that stuff went out the window. Because as you said at the beginning of this podcast, the show is essentially underneath everything else about death. And that what needed to happen at the very end is they all needed to say goodbye. And we needed to get a sense of there being something meaningful about what they had been through. Because if there was nothing meaningful about what they had been through, then, okay, that was a fun story. Who cares? It needed to point forward a little bit in an emotional way and a spiritual way, I would say, and not in a dry academic way. So we started talking a year earlier about what that would look like. And some of it kind of clicked into place fairly early because, like I said before, all of these conceptions of the afterlife that deal with eternity and all philosophical investigations of those eternities come to the same conclusion, which is if you do anything long enough, it gets boring. So we had come up with the idea that there would be a way that they would change, that they would get to the actual good place. They would see that everybody's miserable, and then they would allow there to be a final step past the concept of eternal happiness. And once we did that, then it was a simple jump to saying like, well, that's what the finale is. The finale is everybody says goodbye one by one. Like they come to a point where in some kind of inexplicable, ethereal way, they feel like they're done with their journey and then they move on. And the ironic thing was that when I realized that's the direction we were heading, I thought like this show has never actually dealt with death. They all died on Earth. That's how you meet them. But we've never talked about death and what it means for the people that get left behind and what it means for people who are sort of contemplating that moment in the future and all that sort of stuff. And so we were able at the very end in this, I think, very lovely way to go all the way back to the beginning and say like, all that stuff that we skipped over, now that's the point. The point is now that we're saying goodbye and that the characters have affected each other's lives in certain ways that allow them to feel okay about their friends leaving them. So the conception of it was sort of hard in a sense because it required us to do a lot of things we hadn't been doing. The writing of it was real hard because that was a real like, man, if we're there's a couple things about it were hard. Number one, it's going to be really sad. Like we're ending this comedy show in a really sad way. But also we are not, we can't really rely on a lot of the stuff we've been relying on to guide us, which is why there's a scene with Eleanor and Chidi where they're saying goodbye because Chidi's leaving the next day. And she actually says to him, like, this is sad. Like, do you have some kind of philosophy, like some kind of John Locke quote or something that I can hold on to? And he literally says to her, like, those guys are rules and regulations. Like if you, for stuff like this, you got to turn to the East. And it was the first time that we had explicitly gone Eastern in the philosophy because things like Buddhism are much better at comforting people than the rules. And then, Immanuel Kant is not going to sit by your hospital bed and hold your hand as you're moving on into the afterlife. Like that's not what his thing was. Their thing was about how we act on Earth, and the Buddhists specifically are the people that I have turned to in my life in moments of great sadness and in discussing the transition moments from life to death and other things like that. So it was very tricky and hard, but I'm very happy that we did it because I feel like it ended the show in a way that felt very heart-wrenching instead of very academic. And a lot of the show had been pretty academic. And I think that when things end, you don't need a professor. You need like a friend to hold your hand. And that was the vibe we wanted, was like the show's going to hold your hand a little bit as it's ending and give you some comfort when you look to the future.
I think I misspoke earlier when I said that, death isn't something you see on primetime TV much. That is, of course, true, but death isn't something as a culture that we're particularly like well versed in talking about.
No.
Pretty recently I had someone I know die, and I do think that the Good Place gave me a framework for thinking about it, or thinking about death, that I didn't have prior to the show, and I'm very grateful for. So I guess to kind of start to round out this conversation, Mike, I'd be really curious to know like what your hopes are. Do you kind of hope that that's a legacy of the show, that you kind of gave people a means to talk about death or think about death and to bring some levity to it? Because, even sort of post-COVID, after 2 years just surrounded by reminders of our mortality, we're still not particularly equipped to talk about it or think about it and be honest about it. Do you kind of hope that The Good Place as a show was able to move the needle in that sense?
I do, honestly. It wasn't the goal we started with. The goal we started with was to ask questions of how we might be a little bit better today than we were yesterday, and how that ethics and morality is like a filter that we should put into our brains in order to kind of self-interrogate and examine our own behavior and potentially make slightly better choices, knowing that it's futile and that you're still going to screw up and cause pain and harm and suffering, because that's just the nature of existence. Is you're not going to get it right. You're going to, maybe, if you're lucky and if you're careful and you're deliberate, you can get better, but you're not going to get it right. That was the original stated goal. At the end, especially from the time that we really started talking about the finale, that did become a goal, because I think you're right. We are uniquely terrible at talking about death. Death is something that is embarrassing and shameful and painful in our culture, and that has it's very odd. It has a stigma to it, even though it's a thing that has happened to, or will happen to quite literally every single one of us. It's, other than COVID, it's probably the only thing we can guarantee we will all live through or experience. And I will say that one of the most rewarding things about having worked on the show is that a number of people have contacted me or reached out to me in some way, or to someone who worked on the show, to say exactly what you just said, which is that episode and that moment specifically of Chidi relating the metaphor that Thich Nhat Hanh, the Vietnamese monk, first sort of designed about a wave returning to the ocean, and that being a different way to think about death, that brought them some comfort or some calmness in a turbulent moment. And that is a lovely thing to hear, for obvious reasons. And I don't know if I don't know if any show has any kind of legacy. I don't know what that means really. I think that we're drowning in content right now. There are 27 new shows per hour that come online on any number of streaming services. And the idea that anything will be permanent or will survive the sort of tsunami of content that we've undergone in the last decade or so, I think it's a fool's errand to try to guess what will be still watched 5-10 years from now. But if any part of the show survives and becomes part of the lives and the ways that people understand their existence, I think I would ultimately, in a weird way, prefer it if that were what survived. Than if the ethics survived, because there are other places in pop culture that you can see examinations of good and bad behavior. You can watch Breaking Bad and you can draw conclusions about the ways that we make choices and the ways that we, morally speaking, throw good money after bad, after making bad decisions and that sort of thing. But I think that there aren't many shows, at least comedy shows, that are going to traffic in philosophical approaches to death and transition in the way that we did at the very, very end. So I mean, look, there are also a ton of shows that talk about death. There are shows that explicitly talk about death. There are entire premises of shows that are about coping with death, and how you move on after someone close to you dies. Like that's a very common refrain. But I did find that like the thing that most people at least the thing that the most people come to me to talk about at the end of the day, is that moment in that episode. So that's lovely. I'm very happy if that's the case.
This conversation has gone from talking about the best way to sort of realize a person having a butt on their head to the grandest conversations about mortality.
Well, you can also see why I maybe wrote a scene where Eleanor was farting uncontrollably, right? Like if you're going to head in this direction, you have to have something to keep people watching.
Yeah. Well, Mike, this has been so much fun. Just to finish, one of our Patreon supporters, Even Mirko, wrote in to ask, when they think of your work, they think smart comedy, and they were curious to know if you had any aspirations to write a smart thriller, a smart horror, or a smart sci-fi one day to maybe expand beyond comedy and expand beyond TV comedy.
Well, that's flattering. Thank you, Patreon supporter. One of the reasons that I wanted to do The Good Place is because it was an idea that was markedly different from the ones that I had before. And that I think it's fair to say it is sci-fi. It's a sci-fi philosophical comedy, I guess is what it is.
Yeah.
And sci-fi is a genre I adore and consume a lot of in both movies, TV shows, books, everything. And I really enjoyed it. And I enjoyed the novelty of it for my own life. And it has made me focus more on the idea of writing things other than the kinds of things that I've already written. So the next thing I'm doing is I'm adapting the movie Field of Dreams into a limited series, which I'm working on now, which will be out probably next summer. And that's wildly different, in part because it's not per se a comedy at all. Like it has certain elements of levity and lightness to it, and it is also a little bit science fiction. It's a little bit of everything, but it's not anywhere close to the kind of thing I've written before. So yeah, I think I've been doing this long enough now that branching out is the thing that feels risky and exciting and scary, and that's as big a draw as anything else to me, to just try something new. I think that it's like the fear of failure is very enticing to me. Like the feeling of like, this could be really, I could really fall on my face here. That's a really exciting feeling, and I think it's what drives people very frequently to branch out, because I think apathy and kind of like laziness are death knells for writers. Like I think you can just do the same thing over and over and over again and make a very good living. But at some point, if you're not like emotionally connected to whatever it is that you're doing, then what's the point of this? Like, I would so much rather take a huge swing and fall on my face than just play it safe and try to do the same thing over and over again, because there's no value in that, really, except like capitalistically. so yeah, I hope that is the thing that I get to keep doing. I mean, the problem, of course, is if you do fall on your face and you fall on your face enough times, then you don't get to make anything. people stop paying you to make stuff. So yeah, I hope I don't fail to the point where my license to create TV shows gets revoked and I have to become a veterinarian or something.
Well, A, your track record suggests that's probably not going to happen, Mike. And B, if it does, you've always got the violin saleswoman with the checkered past to fall back on.
Always go back. Always go back to that gem.
Hit. Yeah. All right, Mike, I'll let you go. But man, thank you so much for this. I've really enjoyed this conversation. Thanks for coming on Script Apart.
My pleasure. Thank you for having me.
You've been listening to Script Apart, hosted by me, Al Horner, produced by Camille Demek. Thanks for tuning in. We'll see you next time.